Let me just start off by welcoming everyone here. My name is A.R. Hoffman. I'm the associate editor of the New York Sun. It's wonderful to see so many readers and listeners with us. This is our second live taping of Sanity, and another smash success already. And we're just deeply grateful for your support, your attention, your consideration, and we hope to go from strength to strength, so many more in the future. I want to welcome Professor Alan Dershowitz. Not the least of his achievements is he is a contributor to the New York Sun and a columnist for us. He's also, of course, Professor Emeritus at Harvard Law School, where he taught for 50 years. He was the youngest tenured law professor in Harvard's history, also the author of more than 50 books, 1,000 articles, and defense counsel in some of the defining cases in American law over the past several decades. So really an honor to have you here, Alan.
Well, thank you. I told your grandmother that you were very smart, and she said, I know that. Right. And I said, you were very smart even though you went to Harvard. And she said, I know that. And it was such a pleasure to meet your grandmother, your father. May Dora Ladora, 3 generations. May you keep it up.
Thank you so much.
I didn't go to Harvard, but I'm smart too. If my grandmother were here, she would have told you that.
What you're saying is I didn't go to Harvard, therefore I'm smart.
Yeah. Although Penn isn't
Yeah,
so
I went
hot
to
these
Penn,
days
so
either,
I'm
Rebecca.
on the fence.
Penn, yeah, my son went to Penn, I know, yeah.
All right, well, let's dive right into it. Really what I've been wanting to ask you, Alan, is about sort of the constitutional climate that we're in right now. This past week saw arguments at the Supreme Court over President Trump's effort to abolish birthright citizenship, as well as the administration's desire to ban national or universal injunctions. That's just when one federal judge can issue an injunction that applies to the whole country. So maybe using that as a jumping off point, would love to hear just your thoughts about where things are right now.
Well, let me start with my conclusion. We are not in a constitutional crisis. We are in a constitutional conflict, much like what happened when Jefferson attacked the Adams appointment of judges and refused to allow the nomination of Marbury to go through, leading to Marbury versus Madison. When Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus, when President Roosevelt put 110,000 Americans of Japanese descent into detention centers. We've only had 2 constitutional crises in our history, and they both involved, obviously, slavery and race. One was Andrew Jackson, when he refused to comply with John Marshall's decision involving Native Americans, and he said, you rendered the decision, now you enforce it. That was a constitutional crisis. And obviously the Dred Scott case leading to the Civil War was a constitutional crisis. The rest were conflicts which we are able to resolve, and we have resolved them. That's our system of checks and balances. President Trump has stated over and over again he will not defy the Supreme Court. Look, as a constitutional lawyer for 60 years, there are many cases written by the Supreme Court that I wish I could defy because they're just dead wrong. Judges are not final because they're so smart. They're considered so smart only because they're final. And they make mistake after mistake.
No offense to any judges in the audience.
Mistake. No, the only judge that I've met here is an appellate court judge. So everybody knows that he is sometimes wrong. That's why he has a Supreme Court put above him to correct him when he's wrong. We have a process, and the process generally works. And President Trump has, of course, pushed the envelope further than most presidents, not quite as far as Lincoln and Jefferson and Roosevelt, but pretty far. And he tests the Constitution. Now, take, for example, the issue of birthright citizenship. One of the dumbest things any Constitution could ever include. I can imagine anything dumber than saying you're a citizen of the United States with all the benefits of citizenship if you happen to be born here and then you left 2 weeks later and never had any connections to the country. It's a ridiculous concept. We understand that when you pass constitutional rules, you sometimes have to overstate them to make sure they cover everybody. These was intended to cover the children of slaves, but the Constitution gets, with great inflation, a C+ for draftsmanship. There are so many mistakes in the Constitution, so many errors. Second Amendment filled with problems, the Fourth Amendment filled with problems. Virtually, when you study any part of the Constitution, you say to yourself, how could they have drafted it that way? I have a cartoon that I have hanging in my office, and it has two of the founders. They're writing the Constitution, and they're saying, just for fun, why don't we make what's constitutional and unconstitutional a little wishy-washy? And they did it. They succeeded. It's very, very wishy-washy. So take the issue.
ChatGPT, James Madison.
Say that?
ChatGPT, James Madison.
Yeah.
To write.
So take the issue of birthright citizenship. Dumb. But it's in the Constitution. But there's a way to make it smarter. So it involves legislation. The Constitution says that if you're born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, you are a native, natural-born citizen, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That's up to Congress. And Congress can pass a statute very easily saying a baby born in the United States of parents who are illegal, who then leaves in less than 6 months and never comes back, is not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. That would end the issue, and the Supreme Court would uphold that and say, no, they are not citizens of the United States, but it involves legislative action. The same thing is true with national injunctions. Easy to solve that problem. Just have Congress pass a statute saying that when two people under Article 3 of the Constitution litigate against each other, that the impact of the case will not extend beyond the parties at issue, except under principles of stare decisis, etc. Or, more creatively, Congress could enact a new court, much like the FISA court, say consisting of 5 distinguished judges from around the country, 2 district court judges, a circuit court judge, maybe a judge from the Court of Claims, 5 judges like the FISA court. And if you want to get a national injunction, you go to that court. And that court then has jurisdiction to grant a national injunction, subject to immediate appeal to the Supreme Court. For example, the issue that was really never really fully discussed during the oral argument, which was a pretty good oral argument, I give that one about a B+. The oral argument was pretty good, but they didn't fully discuss the following issue. There were 4 judges who ruled that the executive order declaring birthright citizenship is unconstitutional. Okay, that's easy. What if there was a 5th judge who said, no, it's completely lawful, and I hereby enjoin anybody who wants to stop this from happening? So you get a conflict between district court judges. How do you enforce a nationwide injunction? So the best way to deal with some of these issues are legislatively. We have 3 branches of government. And right now, the first branch of government, that's Article 1, the Congress, is asleep. And I don't understand the reason for it. They're controlled by both houses are controlled by the party of the president, and they're just doing nothing. And they could be resolving some of these issues to avoid a constitutional crisis. So I think we're going to have an interesting 3.5 years with the president pushing the envelope as far as he can, with the courts pushing back, and with the legislature falling asleep. And we'll see. The court will come down, for example, I know you're going to ask me about it, so I'll anticipate it, on the issue of deportation. We know what the court's going to do, and it's already done it. Monday, yesterday, and Friday. The Supreme Court basically has said, President, you can decide who is allowed to be a citizen of the United States. You get to make the substantive decision as the head of the executive, but you have to do it right. You have to dot every constitutional I and cross every constitutional T, and you have to do it within due process. Now, the most misunderstood term in the Constitution, appears twice in the Constitution, is due process of law. But when you think about it, what it means is obvious. It's the process that is due to you. It's not an abstract, objective term. It's a subjective term that varies with the parties and with what's going on. So if you're a citizen of the United States and you are accused of the crime, for example, of coming over the border illegally or a more serious crime, you get the full panoply of rights. An indictment, right to counsel, privilege against self-incrimination, presumption of innocence, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the process that's due you as a citizen if you are charged with a crime. But if you're a student on a student visa who is being accused of making a speech that is incompatible with the foreign policy of the United States, then the process due you is much, much less. A, you have the right to prove you have a visa, and it's a legitimate visa, because the government might say, no, you don't have a legitimate visa. You have if they say your papers, please, you have a right to show your papers. And then you have a right to dispute what you said, or that you said it, or that you meant it. And so the process due you is much, much slighter, but it's still due process.
I want to ask you about that due process.
Sure.
A lot of people upstairs were wanting to bring this up. So based on what you just said about the process that is due that illegal immigrant in this case, wouldn't, let's say, for instance, many of them have been registered under the CBP One app under the Biden administration. So their status as illegals is already established. So why do they need due process then again to prove that they are illegal rather than legal immigrants being deported?
What if they say no? Well, we don't agree with you. We're not included in that. I have a right to show a paper that says I'm not included with that. Or we think it's unconstitutional.
Right.
So the only people who get no process at all, are non-Cubans, because Cubans, there's an exception to this, but non-Cubans who climb over a fence or cross the Rio Grande and are caught within 2 minutes of coming into the country, 15 feet away from the border. The courts have held they have no due process. They can simply be physically taken and removed and brought back in the country. There's a special rule for Cubans. Mm-hmm. It's called the 1 foot rule. If you can make it into the country and put 1 foot on the ground, you get asylum status. But that's legislative and administrative. So
so then the question is, and I think I've heard you address this in different speeches you've given, maybe you can help us understand, the practical question. Yeah. If everyone is entitled to this kind of due process and we have 20 million illegal aliens in our country, what's the possibility of getting even a meaningful number of them out that it wouldn't take 10 years to accomplish?
Very simple. No, it'll take 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. Here's what you do. You take them out of the country without giving them process. You then give them an opportunity to challenge their deportation by Zoom from the American embassy or from some other place. Due process doesn't mean you have to be there in person. Due process means that you have to have an opportunity to challenge and a guarantee that if the court rule, take for example this guy from Maryland.
I was just going to raise that. I mean,
Okay.
you said, this is a constitutional conflict. If there would be one example where it seems pretty close to a crisis, it would be in the case of Kilmar
because the court
Garcia.
did say you have to facilitate his return. The court was wrong. The court didn't read the briefs. The court didn't understand the case. This guy was not given the right not to be in the country. The court had already decided he's deportable. He just wasn't deportable to, was it Guatemala or Nicaragua? I forget what. No, it's not El Salvador. That's where he went. Right. The actual asylum grant was to a third country. I don't remember which one it was. You can check it out on Google. But the court got it all wrong. So he had no right to be in the country, and the court has no right or no power to bring him back to the country. His only right is whether he can be compelled to stay in El Salvador, Guatemala, or Nicaragua, or have his deportation order modified by a discretionary grant of asylum. Remember, asylum is not a constitutional right. 900 Jews will tell you that when their boat, the St. Louis, wasn't allowed to dock in New York. They had no right to asylum. They should have been given it, but they have no constitutional right to do it. So the Supreme Court, again, it got it wrong because it didn't understand the facts of the case. he was not given the right to stay in the United States. He was given the right discretionarily not to be sent to a particular country where his life could have been threatened. And by the way, he was sent to El Salvador, which has a decent legal system. People say, oh my God, he was sent to a horrible prison. Has anybody been in Rikers Island? What American, what New Yorker has the right to complain about any prison? I mean, I've been in gulags in China. I've been in gulags in Russia. I've been in gulags in many other countries in the world. Nothing is worse than Rikers Island.
Not as an inmate.
Nothing is worse than Rikers
Can I
Island.
just, so back to the Dershowitz law of immigration that you'd like to impose on America, and maybe it's helpful. So you're suggesting that we should just deport illegals first to locations that have American embassies and let them then appeal?
Well, you would need to have some due process.
Let me be very clear about that. You have to have probable cause. If you have probable cause, it's like a search warrant. If you have probable cause, you can search without getting further judicial approval. Certain instances, you have to get a warrant. Other instances, if it's subject to arrest, you don't have to get a warrant, but you can do the search. The same thing would be true here. If you have probable cause, you have to establish probable cause. You have to show he's not a citizen. You have to show there's a paper that says he's subject to deportation. And then he's deported. And then he's given a paper with the address of the American embassy, the Zoom numbers, and given an opportunity, scheduled within 5 days, to have an opportunity to due process challenge the deportation.
I'm not sure we have the embassy staff these days to handle this out, right?
Well,
that's another
what
part
percentage
of
of people you think would actually take advantage of it? Very tiny percentage, because vast majority of them are subject to deportation, and they know they'll lose. And that's why when the United States sent out its offer saying if you leave voluntarily, maybe then you can come back, a lot of people have taken advantage of that because they know they don't have a legal claim to being in the country. All they have, let's remember another thing, asylums. Let me give you a trivial pursuit question. We know tens of thousands of cases every year are subject to claims of asylum. What percentage of them do you think are granted after a hearing? About 11%. So almost 90% are false. So the vast majority of asylum claims have no basis at all. They're, for example, I was involved in a case some years ago where an Arab was sent to Israel, and he claimed asylum on the ground that he'd be tortured. I had a case that was in front of Judge Weinstein when he was a federal district court judge. Ramsey Clark represented the Arab, and I was the expert witness on behalf of the United States. And, you know, in a minute, Judge Weinstein concluded that Israel was not going to torture him, and he was not subject to that kind of a claim, and his claim of amnesty was rejected. Interestingly enough, he was then sent back. He blew up a bus, an Egged bus in Tel Aviv, killing 18 people, and he was sent back to Israel, was not tortured, and he was acquitted. He was acquitted after the trial. They couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it was he who planted the bomb. So, you know, most claims of amnesty are rejected, and most claims of violation of due process are ultimately rejected. Why do they make these claims if they're going to be rejected? Because it buys them time. It buys them a year, 2 years, 3 years, and it's been held by bar associations that it's not frivolous to make a claim, even though you know you're going to lose it, if it will buy your client time. Whether that's the right ethics rule or not, I don't know, but that's the way law is practiced by the immigration bar today, just buying time.
So let's pivot, still thinking about concepts like due process and sort of litigation to some of the campus issues, which overlap with these immigration,
Sure.
but also are somewhat distinctive. So let me just start off by asking, you know, Harvard is now suing the Trump administration over the withdrawal of federal funding and other issues, alleging that due process in that context was not followed. So what do you make of that suit and some of the issues right now?
It's a great question.
The higher education front.
On the merits, again, Harvard will lose. I have told Harvard they're going to lose. Larry Tribe has told them they're going to win. Larry Tribe is always wrong. When you look at all of his predictions over the years, he's always wrong because he always makes predictions based on what he wants to have happen. I make predictions based on my scientific knowledge, my study of the court, And the Supreme Court will uphold Harvard's right not to give funding to universities. I'm writing a book about the subject. I think I told you. My working title is Trump to Harvard, Go Fund Yourself. I think that the courts will hold that that unless there's a contractual basis, if there's a contractual basis, okay. But if there's no contractual basis, and if there's no discrimination based on race, gender, or any other invidious classifications, I think Harvard's right to not fund in the future will be upheld. Now, question about tax situation. The president has no right and no power to tell the IRS what to do. The IRS is an independent agency, and president should not ever. I was on Nixon's enemies list. I got audited 4 times in 4 years, earned me a lot of money because I got paid money every time that I was audited. They owed me money. But nonetheless, 4 times I was audited because I was on Nixon's enemies list. We know Nixon told the IRS who to audit, and that shouldn't be happening. And so it's an abuse. On the other hand, it doesn't preclude the IRS from independently making a decision that Harvard is violating Title VI or other rules akin to the rules that were violated in the Bob Jones case. In the Bob Jones case, there were rules regarding race and gender that were being violated. And so we know that there are rules being violated by Penn, by Harvard, by Columbia, by other schools. So it's very likely the court will ultimately uphold some of these remedies. And it's terrible because it means that research funding for cancer will be cut off, and that's a bad thing. But I'm not sure anybody has a constitutional right to be funded even for the most important research in the world.
Apart from kind of the legal analysis, what do you make generally of using sort of that? If we stipulate that there is an anti-Semitism problem on these campuses.
Can somebody bring me some water? I think I was supposed to get it before, but it never came. Okay.
What do you make of using kind of the heavy hand of the government?
Okay, let me throw the question back at you. We're now 1955. I'm in my first year at college, at Brooklyn College. I'm marching in favor of desegregation. I'm going to events applauding Brown versus Board of Education. And I go down south, this is all true, and I participate in civil rights marches. And I noticed that the Ku Klux Klan is coming on the University of Mississippi, University of Alabama, and other campuses wearing their Ku Klux Klan hoods and intimidating black students and telling them not to go to class. There are white teachers teaching white supremacy in the school. And General Eisenhower and then President Kennedy decided you got to do something about this. Eisenhower sends federal troops. Okay, that's one thing. But then hypothetically, this didn't happen. Hypothetically, Kennedy says, wait a minute, these universities are funded by state funds, but they're also funded by federal funds. And we're going to cut off the federal funding if these schools continue to discriminate against blacks and to teach white supremacy. We'd all be applauding that. And you can't applaud that and not applaud what's being done to Jews. You can't have a different standard for fighting discrimination against blacks and discrimination against Jews. So in principle, I have no problem with the federal government enforcing Title VI through withholding funding. As a matter of law, as a matter of policy, I think it's a terrible mistake because it goes too far. Now, some people have an answer to that. And their answer is, this was in an article in today's newspaper, that said all federal funding of all universities for every purpose ought to be cut down, and they ought to create a national, Bureau of Standards or, medical, and all research grants ought to go through that federal funding mechanism, but nothing should go to quite human rights. Let me just take one point here, personal privilege. I have devoted my life to civil liberties, civil rights, human rights. Today, I tear up any envelope that comes that says civil rights, civil liberties, human rights. These terms have become filthy terms, disgusting terms, being used only as weapons against Israel. The Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Council, the Human Rights Watch, they're all horrible, despicable, der Stürme. neo-Nazi, fascist, anti-Israel organizations. They have deprived me of my life's work in human rights, civil rights, civil liberties, and we have to take it back. We can't allow them to hijack these terms and these concepts and use them only against Israel, and that's what's happened.
Okay, so that's the big takeaway, is that those are bad organizations. I couldn't agree more. Can I pivot to First Amendment issues?
Sure.
This is one of my favorite things to talk about on our podcast, and I'm glad I'm up here with two lawyers, because I have a complaint to file with the legal system generally, and this is based on the...
Okay, on behalf of the legal system, I'm here to accept your complaint.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe you can also resolve it for me. The Murthy v. Missouri case, or
What? Say it again.
Murthy v. Missouri case, the censorship case under the last administration, in my reading, clearly proved that the government was involved in a massive censorship operation. They built architecture around censorship to suppress speech of American citizens, and that was bad enough.
Yeah.
But here's my complaint, was that the judge who determined, I think he called it the worst case of First Amendment violation he's ever seen, the remedy was an injunction. He just simply told them, stop it. And as a non-lawyer, I was really surprised that that's the best we could do when our government violates the very First Amendment to our Constitution. The only thing to say is stop. I mean, I just want to hear that there's some hope that there might be a bigger penalty for violating such an important amendment, so that it would disincentivize people from doing it in the future.
Broadly. Both parties are equally guilty of trying to suppress free speech. Free speech in America for politicians means free speech for me, but not for thee. We see today in the newspaper, there were articles about how a Democratic-funded organization, federally funded to try to get better news for America abroad, was used to censor American newspapers and media that was critical of Trump. We know that Trump, if he had his way, would try to suppress CNN and maybe today even Fox, and put Newsmax in charge of all the, and the Sun perhaps, in charge of all reporting. Everybody wants the reporting to just reflect their point of view, and there's equal fault on all sides. Look, if you can get the Supreme Court to say stop, that's your 90% there. You're right. If you have damages, it serves as a deterrent. But look what happened with Newsmax. They have damages against them as a result of a lawsuit brought by anti-Trump people. That can suppress free speech as well. Look, the Supreme Court is, I think, going to reconsider New York Times versus Sullivan. I think it's going to reconsider particularly the malice part of it. I worked on New York Times versus Sullivan as a law clerk. I helped draft the
Maybe, Alan, maybe just tell everyone a little bit what the whole thing is.
The New York Times versus Sullivan was, the New York Times ran an ad that defamed a sheriff in the South, and the sheriff sued the New York Times, and the Supreme Court wrote a decision saying even if there was defamation, it's not enough. If you're a public figure like a sheriff, you have to prove malice, that is actual knowledge or of the falsity or reckless disregard for the falsity. All right, I'm okay with that. But where the Supreme Court went off and went wrong, and mostly, by the way, this is a judge here from the Second Circuit led the way to their going wrong on this, was saying that the issue of whether there's enough malice to get to a jury should be decided by a judge, not by a jury. Now, for me, there's a clash between the First Amendment and the Seventh Amendment. The Seventh Amendment says issues like this, malice is a quintessential factual issue. Did they know? Did they recklessly disregard? That shouldn't be decided by a judge. It should be decided by the jury. I have that case now. I'm bringing it in front of, I have it now in front of the Eighth Circuit, and I'm going to bring it to the Supreme Court on that issue as to whether or not the issue of malice should be decided by a judge or a jury. And so I'm not trying to influence our judge from the Second Circuit here, but that issue may come up before the Second Circuit
Just
as
so
well.
people know, I mean, some of you may have followed Sarah Palin's lawsuit against the
That's
New
right.
York Times,
Yeah.
which she's lost now a couple of times. But this issue of the standard of New York Times v. Sullivan was kind of determinative there. Why don't we pivot again overseas? It was a kind of a dizzying week from the news of kind of Qatar Force One to meetings in Riyadh and Qatar and the UAE. Pointedly, I think no visit to Israel. Some news coming out today that Vance has decided not to go as well. What are you sort of making of what you're seeing, early in the second Trump term, vis-a-vis Middle East policy, Israel, et cetera?
Look, it's all very important, but there's only one important issue. The only important issue, and it's not the Abraham Accords. I worked on the original Abraham Accords. That's fine. The Abraham Accords would be good. The only important issue is whether Iran is allowed to develop a nuclear weapon. And President Trump has said unequivocally no enrichment of centrifuges, no civilian uses that could easily be turned into weaponization and military uses. And Iran has said, no, we're not going to do that. And so the real risk is that Trump becomes Obama and makes a threat the way Obama made a threat involving the Syrian use of chemicals, and he then backs away from the threat, and he loses all of his credibility. If Trump makes that mistake, he then loses his ability to be a deal maker, because his ability to be a deal maker isn't because he's so brilliant or anything like that. He's very smart and he's very, very energetic. It's because he carries through with his threats, and so far he hasn't had to carry through in any threats. It's been enough that he has the power to do that. But if he backs away from this, and if he sends a message to the world, I threatened that I would never allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon, and he then allows them to do it, he is finished when it comes to international diplomacy and threats. Now, that's not going to happen. What may happen is something equally dangerous, but more easily disguised. What he may say is, well, and this is the way he would put it, I threatened Iran, and I said if they develop nuclear weapons or get even closer, or this with centrifuges and enrichment, there will be consequences. And they backed down. But they haven't backed down. But he'll say they did. And he'll say, I won. I prevailed. I'm Trump. I prevailed. I won.
This sounds kind of like the tariff playbook,
yeah,
right?
A little bit. Yeah. But this is much more serious.
Right.
And so I worry that he may declare victory, and we may end up with a deal that's incrementally better, longer, and stronger than the deal that was made by Obama, which I wrote a book about, The Case Against the Iran Deal. I met with Obama in the Oval Office. He called me into the Oval Office to tell me that he would not make that deal, to tell me that he would have Israel's back, to tell me that he would never allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. And then he did have Israel's back to paint the target on. And I ended my relationship with him. I knew Barack as a student at Harvard Law School when he called himself Barry. But I also knew Netanyahu when he called himself Ben Natai. So people do change their names. But Barry called me into the Oval Office, and he said, Alan, you've known me for a long time. You know I'm always straight with you, and I promise you this, that, and the other thing. And then he broke his promise to me, and that ended my relationship with him. I would never have had a conversation with him again after condemning him in my book for violating his promise. And what I'm afraid is Trump's not going to be that dumb. He's not going to violate his promise. But he may accept a deal and say he's won when a lot of people will think that he hasn't won.
Professor, a large part of your career certainly in the last several decades has been defending Israel in the face of its enemies. I wonder, as you look around American college campuses now and around the world, do you feel like the case for Israel has not been made? Would you rewrite that book and offer different advice today? What do you think is happening with the case for Israel?
I can't rewrite the book because I wrote what the truth is. It's just that people aren't particularly caring about that. For example, when I speak on college campuses and I ask how many students know that the Palestinians were offered a state in 1938 by the Peel Commission, 1947, 1948, 1967, 2000, 2001. I quote Clinton about what they were offered, 2005, 2007. Nobody knows. They just don't know. They don't care. So it's not that I haven't written the case, and it's not that I haven't written it persuasively. It's just that people just don't care, and they don't understand the history. As Clinton said in his statement, the Palestinians don't want a state. They just want there not to be a Jewish state. They don't want a two-state solution. They don't even want a one-state solution. They want a no-state solution. They want no state as long as there's no state of Israel. And you cannot understand the phenomenon going on college campuses without understanding the world's unique relationship to Jews. And people ask me all the time, what's my definition of anti-Semitism? It's very simple. Applying a double standard against things that are Jewish or Israeli. That's the definition of anti-Semitism. And that's going on all over the world, the double standard.
Let me ask you, I think you're someone who's known Benjamin Netanyahu a long time as well.
Since 1970.
And you're also someone, I think, who, has always been a stalwart defender of Israel, of course, but also, I don't know, would you call yourself someone of the left?
I would say I was always
liberal.
a classic liberal. Mm-hmm. I define myself as a constitutional liberal, as a constitutional libertarian, really more than a liberal, libertarian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would say who leans a little bit left, but I'm not a leftist.
Right.
I am, a fundamental free speech advocate.
Yeah. And what do you make of sort of the Israeli political scene now?
I don't like it at all. I mean, last time I was in Israel, I met with Smetrich and I met with Ben Gvir, and I really did not like them. Ben Gvir wanted to meet with me because I had been Meir Kahana's lawyer, and he foolishly thought, oh, I must be a supporter of Meir Kahana. I hated Meir Kahana. I was his lawyer because of First Amendment issues, much the same way I was the lawyer for the Nazi Party and the communists. But he didn't understand that, so he thought I was a Kahanist, and therefore he wanted to meet with me, and we met, and we had a very unpleasant meeting. So I don't like the two of them. I'm not crazy about the current Israeli government. I'm a friend of Netanyahu. I've never been to Israel without having dinner at their home. And he's never been to anywhere where I live without having dinner with me. In fact, Friday night every year when he comes to speak at the UN, we have Shabbat dinner, and I'm always asked to do the Dvar Torah. Because,
I'm shocked.
Because nobody else in the Netanyahu group knows anything about the Torah, and although I was a failed yeshiva student, at least I can read the Torah. So I give the Dvar Torah. So I've known Bibi for a long time, and we've agreed, we've disagreed. He's one of the smartest people I know. He's one of the most energetic people. I wrote a book a few years ago, and when I was at his house, we had dinner, and you start dinner at 10 o'clock at Bibi's house. So we had dinner, finished about 1.
Are there drinks first, or what? You just walk in at 10 o'clock?
No, you stay there. You stay there. You come at 9.
Yeah.
Appetizers, Sarah serves you, and kids are around, and then
With
Bibi
a smile, yeah.
walks in and sits down. And then at about 1 o'clock, I gave him a copy of a book, galleys of a book I was writing, 1 o'clock. 7 in the morning, he called me, having read the book, with comments and criticisms. I mean, the guy works like hell. And he's very, very energetic. And I knew his father. When I first met him in 1970, he was a center-right person, but he was very center. His father was very right. His father was obviously a Begin, Jabotinsky supporter. I grew up in the tradition of Ben Gurion and Rabin and people like that.
I have to go off script and just ask something a little cheeky, but is it illegal to have knowledge of a president's mental decline and not report it to the country?
It's not illegal. It is highly immoral. And of course, people knew about Ronald Reagan's dementia toward the end of his life. And obviously, everybody in the White House knew about Woodrow Wilson's stroke and probably Franklin Roosevelt's diminished capacity in the last month or so, although his death was a little bit more sudden. I mean, he did go to Yalta. But we've had diminished presidents before. But this is a terrible story, just a terrible, terrible story. When you think about what, they say, oh, what did he make any mistakes? Well, we don't know. We don't know what options he didn't pursue. And the thing that shocks me, too, is he was probably so concerned, and this is just a theory, so concerned about this not coming out, he may not have gotten the best medical care that may have resulted in his current situation with cancer. I can't imagine a president of the United States not picking up symptoms of what has now become a metastasized cancer for such a long period of time. It's a very strange. I mean, people do, that does happen, but you wonder about that.
Could his auto pen EOs or pardons be invalidated?
No, I don't think so. You know who invented the auto pen? Thomas Jefferson. And I have a book called Finding Jefferson, and I own a letter by Thomas Jefferson written to his grandson. I've just bought it for too much money to give as a gift to my grandson. And the letter was written by Thomas Jefferson by his auto pen. It was a very different auto pen. It was not electronic, obviously. It was a pen attached by wires to two other pens. And everything he wrote would then be written on the other pages. And you can tell whether it's done by an auto pen because it sometimes skips a couple of parts of a word. So I own an auto pen by Thomas Jefferson. No, I think that a president has the right to decide. And, every senator, every congressman now uses auto pens to sign a great many things.
Okay, so we have a question from the audience. This is kind of a fun one. Forgive it. Which of your more quotation, open quote, famous, end quote, clients did you feel the most and least sympathetic toward?
Okay, I think both are easy. Most sympathetic was obviously Natan Sharansky. There, but for the grace of God, go I. Sharansky and I, both of our grandparents were born in what is now Poland, Ukraine. His parents took a right turn and went to Moscow. My parents took a left turn and went to Ellis Island. Had it been reversed, I would have been the dissident and he would have been my lawyer. So I loved Natan Sharansky, and I was dedicated for 8 years to keeping him alive. The Russians wanted him dead. The Soviets wanted him dead. They wanted him to starve to death. They wouldn't kill him. But I had a very, very strong identification with him. And as soon as he got out, I got him out. I arranged the spy trade with Wolfgang Vogel that brought him to the United States. And he threw his arm around me and he whispered in my ear, Baruch Matir Asurim, blessed are those who free the imprisoned. And that was the biggest fee I ever earned in my life. I represented him free of charge, but getting that prayer from him, and we've remained very, very close friends. My most difficult client was Leona Helmsley. And when they call her the Queen of Mean, that's an insult to every mean person. She was so much worse than that. This is a woman who got great pleasure out of hurting people. I stopped talking to her, even though I represented her. I stopped talking to her when I was sitting with her at the Park Lane Hotel having breakfast, and they brought me a cup of tea, and a little bit of the liquid dripped over the cup onto the saucer. She saw it. I didn't even notice it. She grabbed the saucer and the cup, threw it on the marble floor. It broke into a dozen pieces. And she said to the young waiter, now get on your hands and knees and beg me for my job. And I got up and I said, Leona, I will never speak to you again. I will never be in the same room with you again. I'll be in court with you. I'll defend you to the best of my ability, but you are not my friend, and you're not somebody who I have any admiration for. So that's pretty easy. Yeah.
She made it easy for you to hate her.
Okay, question about Qatar.
Yeah.
And specifically about a lawsuit sort of holding them accountable for Hamas's atrocities? We know there are some suits circulating
There's no possibility of that. There's no. They have sovereign immunity, and they were performing a sovereign function. So it's now 6 years ago, and it's July 3rd, the evening of July 4th, 2020. I get a call. Alan, where are you? I'm in the Vineyard. Who is this? Donald. You're always tempted to say Donald who, you know. I did that once when Frank Sinatra, this is name dropping, I'm sorry, but they're funny. Frank Sinatra once called me and said, "Hey, Alan, this is Frank." I said, "Frank who?" He said, "What do you mean, Frank who? It's Frank Sinatra." So I didn't say Donald who. I said, "What can I do for you?" He said, "Where are you?" "On the Vineyard." "How far are you from an airport?" I said, 20 minutes. He said, "Could you be in the airport in an hour?" I said, "Yeah, why?" He said, "I'm having dinner with the Emir of Qatar and his brother, and I need you to persuade him not to oppose the Abraham Accords." We knew he wouldn't support the Abraham Accords, but he needed me. So I get on the plane, and I meet with him. I have a picture of him out of uniform, looking like a professional tennis player with his arm around me, the Emir of Qatar. I'll show it to you later. And then I went to Qatar. I was invited to the World Cup. I didn't go when I discovered how they were mistreating the people who were building the World Cup, so I decided not to go. But I've been in touch with him, and he is what he is. I mean, he is not a man of principle or ideology. He's a man of pragmatism, a deal maker too. Different kinds of deals, and we know that the Israelis approved of his sending money to Hamas. I know because I spoke to the Israelis about it when I went to, after I came back from Qatar. So he's, performed a necessary function, so there's no possibility of him being sued. And Israel really has no, Israel could obviously militarily kill the Hamas leaders who still live there, although many of them have now moved and live in Turkey. But they're not going to do it because he's performing an important function. They are serving as an intermediary to Hamas. We now learn that there's an Arab American who's performing a function like that too. So you never know.
You wanted to talk a little bit about the killing of Sinwar.
What?
You wanted to comment on the killing of Sinwar.
Oh, yeah, no, look, I've been teaching international human rights for years, teaching it straight. And one of the things I write about in my new book, The Preventive State, I have a new book. This is my 57th book, Heinz 57 books. This is my 57th book, The Preventive State. And I write a lot about proportionality. And there's never been a clearer case of proportionality than what occurred a couple of weeks ago. So the Israeli government believed, the IDF believed, that Mohammed Sinwar and about a dozen, and somewhere between 9 and a dozen leaders, terrorist leaders, commanders, were living in a tunnel beneath a hospital and near a school. And so they had to make, of course, the excruciatingly difficult decision. Do you go after these terrorist leaders knowing you're going to kill some civilians? It turns out, in this case, they killed very few civilians. The Palestinians have said it's between 16 and 20, and they don't distinguish between Hamas and civilians, so maybe 10. And so that raises a question of proportionality. You get 10 innocent people being killed in order to kill 10 guilty people who will commit crimes. And the question is, how many innocent civilians are you allowed to kill? I mean, ask the people who bombed Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Tokyo, Berlin. People forget that on D-Day, between D-Day and VE Day, between June 14th, 1944, and May 8th of 1955, you know how many civilians died in the invasion of Germany? Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in the process of defeating Germany, but only Israel is subject to the criticism. And Israel has killed fewer civilians than any country in the history of modern warfare compared to the number of combatants. The usual ratio for NATO has been about 7 and 8 to 1. That is 7 or 8 civilians for every combatant. In Israel, if you take the Hamas figures, it's 3 to 1. The Hamas figures. If you take the Israeli figures, it's 1.2 to 1, practically 1 to 1. The lowest figure for any war, and that doesn't even take into account the fact that Hamas hides their soldiers and their fighters among civilians. So Israel should be praised for the care it's taken to avoid civilian casualties. And then on college campuses today, it's genocide.
One final question, maybe a little bit of a personal one. Someone asks, you mentioned your sort of religious upbringing and rule breaking and all of that. So, and I remember certainly when I was at Harvard, you were a constant presence at Chabad, Jewish student events.
I helped found Chabad at Harvard. We founded it, Ruth Weiss and I and a few others.
Yeah. So just sort of, what do you make of sort of your religious belief, your background, your training, how it kind of has affected your thinking, your career? Has it changed over time?
Well, I don't have any religious belief. I don't have any beliefs. I'm an empiricist. I look at facts. I look at data. I don't believe in things. I don't believe in the First Amendment. What I do is look at countries that have had freedom of speech and countries that hadn't. I look at Churchill when he says democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried over time. So I am the ultimate empiricist, so I'm not a believer. I'm not a believer in anything. I was recently asked to write an article for a book that's called Elevator Pitches for God, and it has 100 prominent authors, each making a one-page elevator pitch for why God exists. And I said, you're asking the wrong person. I'll tell you what I will do for you. I will do a one-page pitch for why you can't prove that God doesn't exist. And I did that. And my ultimate proof, and the reason that I will always be an agnostic, is that I can't believe something came from nothing. Even the Big Bang Theory starts with something. Evolution starts with something. I can get that. I get evolution. I get Big Bang. I don't believe in the Big Bang. I think it's just a variation of the book of Genesis. But I do think that even any of those theories, you have to ask yourself, you can't say turtles all the way down. You got to start with something. And I don't, until science gives me the answer to that, I'll always be an agnostic. But my Judaism is not based on theology. The most uninfluential, great, brilliant scholar of Jewish life is the Rambam, Maimonides. I went to Professor Tversky's class on Rambam at Harvard, and I was always the dissenter in the back row. Rambam was like Larry Tribe, very smart but wrong about everything. And why was Rambam wrong about everything? First, he said, we don't need interpretations, we don't need pilpul, we don't need Talmud, we don't need any of that. The Torah is simple. It has one meaning, one interpretation, and I know what it is, and so I'll write the Mishnah Torah. And, he's right about a lot of things, but it's so arrogant. And then he says, you know what? I'm not going to let only the Catholics have a catechism. I'm going to have a catechism. And so he wrote the Jewish catechism, and we sing it every Shabbos. We sing it, I believe, Ani Ma'amin be'emunah shlema b'viat HaMashiach. 13 principles, and if you disagree with any of the 13 principles, you're like a weed. Well, I'm like 9 for 13. And Jews don't want a catechism. Jews want to argue and debate. And Rambam was just wrong about that. And so, my Jewishness is a Jewishness of argumentation. It's cultural. I go to shul. I love davening. I love chazonim. My grandfathers were both chazonim. I can sing some good chazonish music. I'm not going to do it for you, but I'll keep my day job. But I love cantorial music. I wrote an opera about a cantor. It's Gerson Sirota, who was given the choice during the Warsaw Ghetto situation of leaving and coming to America and singing the Metropolitan Opera, but not saving his family and his people, or staying and dying with his people. That's the theme of the opera. And he stays with his people and dies in the Shoah. And so I'm a deeply committed Jew, but like many, many other deeply committed Jews, I'm not a theological Jew. Herzl was not a theological Jew. Ben-Gurion was not a theological Jew. Rabin was not a theological Jew. Moshe Dayan was not a theological Jew. So I had a big, big fight one day with Shimon Peres, who is a dear friend of mine. I was the only outsider invited when he got his White House medal. That was when I was talking to Barack Obama. And so he gets up and makes a speech, and he says, don't ever ask a Jew who their grandparents were to judge whether they're a Jew. No, ask him, don't ask whether his grandparents were Jewish. Ask whether his grandchildren will be Jewish. And I said, that's the most obnoxious thing I've ever heard. Herzl's grandchildren were not Jewish. Many of the great Jewish leaders, you can't control your children. We can't control our grandparents. We can't control our children. And the idea of judging a Jew by whether his child marries a non-Jew or his grandchild marries a non-Jew is just wrong. And we had this big fight about that. And I said, it's so easy if you live in Israel to marry a Jew. It's great. I tell all my friends, they say, how do we make sure our children marry Jews? Easy, two things. Move to Bnei Brak in Israel, or move to Borough Park. And then they won't meet anybody who's not Jewish. But if you send your kid to Harvard, it's, 20% chance he's going to meet and marry somebody brilliant, fantastic, beautiful, great, who's not Jewish. That's just the choices we make. Propinquity is the most important predictor of marriage.
On that note, the Torah according to Alan Dershowitz. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.